One healthy pepper plant creates a caloric engine capable of producing over 3 kilograms of food. That is a biological factory. Yet, why does a massive bush often yield only 2 small peppers? It seems like bad luck. In reality, it is a misallocation of resources. The plant consumes nitrogen aggressively. It builds broad, dark green solar panels to capture light. The stalk thickens, and the canopy spreads wide, shading the soil below. But energy is limited. If the internal chemistry favors the leaves, reproduction halts. Up close, the stems look robust, but the nodes remain empty. The plant prioritizes vegetative survival over fruit production. Months of irrigation pass. Soil nutrients deplete, labor hours pile up. Yet, at the end of the season, the storage crate remains empty. This is an inefficiency the grower cannot afford. A crop without fruit is simply expensive biomass. On the surface, the organism appears thriving, but inside, hormonal signals are misfiring. Success relies on controlling specific variables. 8 biological triggers determine the final output. By adjusting light exposure, nutrient density, and stress levels, the plant shifts its focus. It stops building foliage and starts pumping sugars into the fruit walls. The goal is heavy, thick-walled peppers with high water content. There is one final nuance here. A critical factor concerns the delicate connection between the stem and the blossom. Flower drop is the silent killer of yields. In fast motion, the bud turns yellow, shrivels, and detaches before pollination occurs. Preventing this mechanical failure requires a precise intervention to ensure the fruit holds on until maturity. Green leaves are usually a sign of health. In this specific case, they are a sign of failure. Why does a massive pepper plant produce 0 calories? It is chemically confused. The culprit is nitrogen. Nitrogen is the primary architect of vegetative structure. It fuels the creation of chlorophyll and drives rapid cell division in the stems. When a seedling is first transplanted, this resource is vital. The plant acts like a biological machine, constructing a solar array to capture energy. It builds a strong framework to support future weight. But timing is critical. Once the plant enters the flowering phase, the biological objective changes. The goal shifts from seizing territory to reproduction. If the grower continues aggressive nitrogen application, the signal is jammed. The plant receives a clear chemical directive: keep expanding. And that is exactly what happens. The organism stays locked in vegetative mode, consuming resources to produce dense foliage. On the surface, the plant looks thriving and robust. But inside, the reproductive mechanism shuts down. Up close, the consequences are visible. Tiny flower buds may form, but they lack the necessary fuel to develop. The stem connecting the flower turns yellow. The bloom detaches. It falls to the damp earth, a wasted biological investment. The plant becomes a factory producing nothing but shade. Correction requires a precise chemical shift. Once the first buds emerge, the nutrient profile must change immediately. The target is a balanced or low nitrogen fertilizer. A ratio such as 5-10-10 is standard. This code represents a reduction in nitrogen and an increase in phosphorus and potassium. These heavy elements are the engines of blooming and fruiting. They harden the cell walls of the fruit and support seed production. There is one nuance here. Application requires restraint. In practical agronomy, concentration acts as a poison. The fertilizer is introduced every 2 to 4 weeks, strictly at half strength. A full dose creates a saline environment that can scorch delicate root hairs, halting nutrient uptake entirely. This is especially critical in container cultivation, where salts accumulate quickly. Mistakes were not an option regarding organic inputs. Fresh manure is strictly forbidden during the active season. It is chemically volatile, loaded with raw nitrogen that takes months to stabilize. Ingredients like blood meal create a similar vegetative spike. The efficient alternative is well-aged compost. It provides a slow, consistent release of nutrients, preventing the plant from going into overdrive. Blind application leads to lost yield. The chemical composition of the soil is invisible to the naked eye. A simple test kit reveals the baseline data. Samples sent to local laboratories provide a detailed map of available resources. This turns cultivation into a calculated equation rather than a gamble. Without this adjustment, the result is a biological paradox. The grower ends up with a massive, impressive bush that refuses to function. Instead of dozens of peppers, the yield is zero. With the right balance, energy converts into edible mass. The harvest is secured. Five peppers instead of 50. That is the precise cost of a biological error. The expectation of a massive harvest often ends with a handful of stunted fruit and a surplus of green biomass. More foliage does not equal more yield. It often signals a systemic failure in resource management. Why does a healthy-looking plant refuse to yield? The answer lies in the energy budget. A common miscalculation occurs when the leaves turn pale. The immediate reaction is to apply chemical reinforcement. Nitrogen is introduced in heavy quantities. In the early vegetative stage, this is correct. But once the flowering cycle initiates, a pale leaf is often a false signal. Upon closer inspection, the chlorosis may indicate a hydraulic deficit or a lack of micronutrients like magnesium. Dumping high nitrogen fertilizer at this stage triggers a vegetative explosion. The plant aborts the reproductive phase. It constructs more stems and leaves to consume the excess nitrates. The biological imperative shifts from creating offspring to expanding territory. The result is a dense green bush with zero caloric output. The second mechanism limiting production is energy input. Bell peppers operate as biological solar panels. They require a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of direct photon bombardment daily to synthesize enough sugars for fruit production. Direct sunlight is a technical term here. It means full exposure. Light filtered through the canopy of an oak tree or the shadow cast by a wooden fence reduces the energy load significantly. Even a 50% reduction in intensity can shut down the fruiting process. On the surface, the plant appears tall and vigorous, but inside, it is starving. When the photon count drops below the critical threshold, the organism enters survival mode. This is the adiolation response. The stem elongates rapidly. The distance between leaf nodes stretches as the plant physically reaches for a light source. It expends vital carbohydrate reserves to gain height. Flowering and fruiting are energy-expensive luxuries. The plant deprioritizes them to prevent total metabolic collapse. Visual markers are obvious to the trained eye. The plant looks leggy. The stem is thin and brittle. Flowers appear, but fail to pollinate. If the crop is positioned against a north-facing wall or tucked behind a row of shrubs, the location itself is the defect. For a plant in the ground, relocation is impossible during the active cycle. Digging up the root ball destroys the delicate feeder roots. However, the environment can be manipulated. Physics offers a solution. Reflective mulch or sheets of aluminum foil placed at the base of the stem act as a secondary light source. Photons strike the metal surface and bounce upward, illuminating the lower canopy and the undersides of leaves. This increases the total solar absorption without moving the crop. It is a crude optical hack, but it creates a net positive in energy retention. Inside the greenhouse, the sun is obsolete. Here, the grower dictates the cycle. Full-spectrum emitters replace nuclear fusion. The lights must hang 12 to 18 inches above the apical meristem. The duration is non-negotiable, 12 to 14 hours of continuous bombardment. This artificial extension forces the plant metabolism to remain active when natural light fails. A timer regulates the day, ensuring the hormonal trigger for flowering remains engaged. Mistakes were not an option for the commercial grower. Without this intervention, the harvest collapses. Flowers form, but the plant aborts them. The pedicel weakens, and the bloom falls to the soil. Any fruit that manages to set remains stunted, thin-walled, and bitter. The ripening process drags on for weeks. It is a frustration of logistics. The plant is green, but the production line is halted. Competition is another factor often ignored in the field. Spatial planning is critical. Placing peppers near tall biomass generators like maize or indeterminate tomatoes guarantees failure. The taller crops monopolize the solar angle. The pepper plant suffocates in the shade, unable to compete for the limited radiation. Genetics offer a partial workaround. Varieties like California Wonder or Big Bertha possess a lower photosynthetic threshold. They can synthesize adequate sugars with only 5 to 6 hours of exposure, but even these resilient lines have limits. The third reason implies a different kind of deficit. Yield is not luck. It is the mathematical result of light management. (85°F). That is the absolute thermal limit for efficient biological production. Why does a crop known for thriving in summer suddenly halt its output? Logic suggests these plants require intense solar exposure. Biology dictates a different reality. There is a specific thermal corridor where the mechanism functions. Optimal fruiting occurs strictly when daytime temperatures hover between 70 and 85 degrees. Push the mercury into the high 80s or 90s, and the system begins to crash. The plant does not just get hot. It enters a state of metabolic emergency. Upon closer inspection, the failure happens at the microscopic level. The pollen grains inside the flower serve a single purpose: reproduction. In extreme heat, this genetic material loses viability. It desiccates. The grains dry out completely or fail to germinate upon contact. Even if the flower remains attached to the stem, fertilization does not occur. The reproductive cycle is severed. In fast motion, the yellow blossom shrivels, detaches from the pedicel, and falls to the arid soil. The potential for a fruit vanishes in seconds. On the surface, the plant appears green and vigorous, but inside, a resource war is taking place. Extreme heat forces the organism to divert all energy toward survival. Transpiration rates skyrocket as the plant attempts to cool its tissues through water loss. The biological imperative shifts. The goal is no longer to produce heavy, energy-expensive pods. The goal is simply to maintain turgor pressure and prevent wilting. The plant produces more leaves because foliage is cheap to grow. Fruit is chemically expensive. Until the environmental stress is reduced, the factory shuts down its assembly line. But this physiological deadlock can be broken. The solution involves artificial environmental control. Solar intensity requires mechanical mitigation. The primary tool is agricultural shade cloth. A density of 30 to 50% is sufficient. This material lowers the ambient temperatures around the foliage by several degrees. It filters the radiation without halting the photon absorption required for photosynthesis. The logistics are precise. The barrier is deployed strictly during the solar peak. This window typically runs from 11 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Once the sun dips, the shield retracts. It acts as a thermal buffer. It takes the edge off the radiation, preventing the reproductive organs from scorching. Ground-level insulation is equally critical. A thick layer of organic mulch, straw, or shredded leaves forms a physical barrier over the root zone. This is not just decoration, it is an engineering necessity. Direct solar radiation is blocked before it hits the soil. Subterranean temperatures remain stable. Moisture is locked in. When the roots are cool and hydrated, the vascular system transports water efficiently to the upper canopy. The plant manages thermal stress with far greater efficiency. Timing is the final variable in this equation. Hydration must occur in the early morning hours. Introducing water at noon is resource mismanagement. The fluid evaporates before uptake occurs. Early irrigation allows the root network to fully saturate the cellular structure before the heat peaks. Simultaneously, the foliage dries before nightfall. This eliminates the breeding ground for fungal pathogens. Neglect leads to immediate yield collapse. Without intervention, the observer will notice a mass abortion of flowers. The vegetative mass expands, but the harvest is zero. Weeks of potential output are deleted from the season. By the time the weather cools naturally, empty branches. Sometimes, failure does not look like death. It looks like absence. The fourth reason for high biomass but zero yield lies in the darkness. Most growers obsess over the intensity of the midday sun. They forget that the biology of the pepper plant is regulated by what happens after sunset. Nighttime temperatures are the silent switch for production. Bell peppers operate within a rigid thermal corridor, 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the only range where the plant can successfully shift from survival mode to reproduction. Why does this specific window matter? On the surface, the plant appears to be sleeping, but inside, complex metabolic processes are running at full speed. The plant uses these dark hours to process the sugars generated during the day. It repairs cellular damage. Most critically, it solidifies the fruit set. If the temperature deviates from this 10-degree safe zone, the biological assembly line stops. Consider the cold spectrum first. When night air drops below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the organism enters a state of preservation. It does not wilt. It simply pauses all forward progress. The mechanism effectively jams. At the flower level, the consequences are visible. The stem connecting the blossom to the branch weakens. A flower that was days away from becoming a pepper turns yellow. It detaches and falls to the dirt. The plant is programmed to abort fruit when the environment is hostile. It hoards energy to keep the root system alive rather than wasting resources on offspring that will freeze. In a production scenario, a single week of cold nights can erase a month of potential harvest. But that is only half the equation. Heat is equally destructive. If the thermometer stays above 75 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, the plant faces a different crisis. It cannot cool down. During the day, the leaves absorb massive amounts of heat. The night is required to dissipate that thermal load. Without a temperature drop, the plant remains in a state of high stress. It pants biologically. Respiration rates increase, burning up the sugars meant for the fruit. Up close, the damage is microscopic but fatal. Pollen grains become sterile. They lose their viability in the heat. You will see flowers open, but pollination fails. The ovary never swells. The flower simply dries up and drops. How do you solve a problem you cannot see? For cold nights, the solution is physical insulation. You must build a trap for infrared radiation. Row covers or cloches are deployed in the late afternoon. The concept is simple thermodynamics. The soil absorbs heat all day. By covering the crop before the sun fully sets, you capture that rising warmth. A simple fabric sheet creates a microclimate 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the ambient air. This is enough to keep the metabolic engines running. However, there is a danger here. Leaving these covers on past sunrise creates an oven effect. The internal temperature spikes within minutes, cooking the foliage. Removal at dawn is mandatory. Logistics also play a role in prevention. Smart cultivation begins before the seed hits the soil. Starting seedlings indoors allows you to control the environment completely. Transplanting to the open field happens only when the weather data confirms consistent lows above 60 degrees. The calendar is irrelevant. Only the temperature gauge dictates the schedule. Dealing with high heat requires a focus on one dark, sunken spot. That is all it takes to destroy weeks of agricultural labor. The fifth reason bell pepper plants prioritize foliage over production is a failure of structural engineering. Specifically, a deficit of calcium at the critical moment of fruit formation. While nitrogen drives green growth, calcium plays a far more rigid role. It is the biological concrete of the plant world. It constructs strong, impenetrable cell walls within the developing pepper. Without this reinforcement, the fruit's architecture collapses. Why does a seemingly healthy plant produce rotting fruit? The answer lies in the stability of the supply chain. Upon closer inspection, the symptoms of deficiency are unmistakable. The bottom of the pepper softens. A watery lesion appears. Within days, it dries into a black, leathery depression known as blossom end rot. This tissue death is irreversible. The pepper does not heal. The biomass is wasted, and the grower is forced to cull the fruit. But there is a paradox here. In many cases, the soil is rich in calcium. The raw materials are present in the ground. The plant simply cannot seize them. The primary culprit is the transport mechanism. Calcium is immobile. It does not actively seek the roots. It moves exclusively within the stream of water absorbed by the plant. It is a passive passenger on a hydraulic current. If the soil moisture fluctuates, the transport halts. Consider the process in the field. The soil dries out. The water pressure drops. The delivery of calcium to the furthest tips of the fruit stops instantly. The plant cannot pull the nutrient up. The cells at the blossom end run out of building materials and die. On the surface, the leaves remain green and turgid. But inside the fruit, the cellular structure is disintegrating. The fix requires strict logistical control. Consistency is more valuable than volume. The target is 1 to 2 inches of water per week, adjusted for local heat evaporation rates. This is not a suggestion. It is a requirement for turgidity. Deep saturation triggers a survival response in the root system. The roots do not just sit in the topsoil. They drill downward, seeking the stable moisture reserves found in the lower strata. Shallow watering trains roots to stay near the surface, where the soil bakes and dries rapidly. The goal is soil that remains cool and damp, never swampy, never akin to dust. To track this, precision is necessary. A simple cylindrical vessel or rain gauge placed near the stalk acts as a data point. When the container collects 1 inch of fluid over 7 days, the irrigation schedule is optimized. But what if the soil is truly depleted? A soil test provides the hard data. If calcium levels are chemically low, supplements are required. Gypsum is the preferred industrial solution. It introduces calcium sulfate without altering the pH balance of the substrate. This is critical. Shifting the acidity can lock out other vital nutrients. The grower incorporates gypsum into the beds before planting or applies it as a side dressing to established crops. Organic recycling offers another path, but physics dictates the speed. Crushed eggshells contain the necessary carbonate. However, the particle size matters. A large shell fragment is biologically inert for the current season. It takes years to decompose. Upon closer inspection, a fine powder reacts differently. The increased surface area allows soil bacteria to break down the material rapidly, releasing calcium ions into the solution. For immediate intervention, time is the enemy. Foliar sprays containing calcium nitrate bypass the root system entirely. The solution is applied directly to the leaf surface. The plant absorbs the mineral through its stomata, addressing the deficit in hours rather than weeks. But a warning is necessary: 6.0 to 6.8. These numbers dictate survival. The sixth reason for green growth but zero harvest is a chemical blockade. It comes down to soil potential hydrogen, or pH. This is the invisible variable. You cannot see acidity with the naked eye. You cannot feel alkalinity, but the root system detects it instantly. This metric determines the solubility of every nutrient in the ground. It has a massive impact on whether the pepper plant absorbs fuel or starves. Why does a plant die of hunger in a field full of fertilizer? It seems illogical. But in reality, chemistry dictates access. If the pH is incorrect, nutrients get locked up. They bind into insoluble compounds. It is like a warehouse full of food with the doors welded shut. The resources are present, but the plant cannot physically transport them across the cell membrane. Bell peppers demand a strict biological corridor. They require a pH range between 6 and 6.8. This is slightly acidic to neutral. Within this specific window, the chemistry unlocks. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium dissolve into the soil solution. Calcium and magnesium become mobile. Trace elements remain stable. The roots absorb these ions efficiently, but deviation brings consequences. On the surface, the soil looks rich and dark, but chemically, it might be a hostile environment. If the pH drops below 6, the ground becomes too acidic. This triggers a chain reaction. Critical nutrients like phosphorus and calcium react with iron and aluminum in the soil. They become solid and unavailable. The plant needs calcium to build cell walls and fruit tissue. Without it, the structure weakens. Phosphorus deficiency halts the energy transfer. Flowering slows down. Fruit development stops. The plant continues to exist, but it becomes biologically useless to the grower. Upon closer inspection, the leaves turn dark green but remain small. The stems lack rigidity. Go above 6.8 and the opposite crisis emerges. Alkalinity rises. Now iron and manganese precipitate out of the solution. They turn into solids the roots cannot process. The visual evidence appears on the foliage. The leaf tissue turns pale yellow while the veins remain dark green. This is intervenal chlorosis. It is a classic distress signal of iron deficiency. The plant suffocates for micronutrients. Fruit production collapses. Guessing is dangerous here. Precision is required. The first step in practical agronomy is data collection. You must test the substrate. A simple chemical test kit provides a color-coded baseline. A digital meter offers decimal point precision. For industrial certainty, samples go to a local extension office. The laboratory analyzes the molecular composition. They map the nutrient density and acidity levels. This provides a tactical overview of the ground beneath the crop. It is essential for long-term planning. Once the data is confirmed, adjustment begins. If the readout shows high acidity, the ground needs neutralization. The standard tool is agricultural lime, calcium carbonate. It is a white powder derived from limestone. It does not work instantly. It reacts slowly with soil moisture, gently shifting the chemical balance upward. Dosage depends on the soil type. Clay requires more lime than sand. If the readout shows high alkalinity, the strategy reverses. The goal is acidification. Elemental sulfur is the primary agent. Bacteria in the soil oxidize the sulfur, creating sulfuric acid. This reaction lowers the pH over time. Organic matter also plays a role. Pine needles decompose. Peat moss breaks down. These materials release mild acids over months. They improve the soil structure while adjusting the chemistry. The scale of this process is significant. Speed is the enemy. The soil is not inert dirt. It is a living system. Millions of microorganisms inhabit every cubic centimeter. A sudden chemical spike shocks them. The biological network crashes. 1 liter of water, applied incorrectly, it becomes a poison rather than a resource. Why do lush green pepper plants refuse to bear fruit? The answer often lies in hydraulic instability. The 7th reason for crop failure is an erratic water supply. It implies a simple process, yet in practical agronomy, it is the most common point of failure. Both extremes of the spectrum cause total system collapse. Excessive moisture drowns the organism. Scarcity triggers a shutdown. But the most dangerous scenario is inconsistency. A cycle of drought followed by a sudden flood creates a biological shock that the plant cannot regulate. The mechanism of production is disrupted. The plant cannot establish a predictive rhythm. Instead of allocating energy to fruit generation, it remains in a perpetual state of emergency response. Consider the physics of overwatering. When soil pores remain saturated, gas exchange stops. Roots require oxygen just as much as leaves require carbon dioxide. Submerged in stagnant moisture, the cellular structures begin to drown. They suffocate. This triggers the onset of necrosis. On the surface, the soil looks rich and hydrated, but underground, The root system is rotting into a black mush. Without healthy roots, nutrient uptake halts. The biological pump fails. Visual markers appear quickly. Leaves turn yellow and wilt, starving even in the presence of abundant water. The plant effectively dies of thirst while drowning. But there is another side to this equation. Underwatering forces the organism into a hard defensive stance. When moisture drops below critical levels, the pepper plant shifts priorities. Preservation of the stem takes precedence over reproduction. In fast motion, leaves curl inward like closing fists to reduce surface area. This is a mechanical reaction. The plant seals its stomata, the microscopic pores on the leaf surface, to prevent transpiration. But a sealed leaf cannot ingest carbon. Photosynthesis decelerates. Energy reserves deplete. The plant initiates an abort sequence. Flowers detach and fall to the ground, sacrificing potential 1 to 2 inches of water per week. That is the biological limit for survival. In most climates, this specific volume separates a bountiful harvest from a withered crop. But volume alone is not the solution. The goal is consistent saturation, not a stagnant swamp and not an arid wasteland. The target is a state of steady, uniform humidity. Why do plants die even when watered? Because the application method is flawed. The critical concept here is deep watering. It is not enough to wet the dust on the surface. The moisture must penetrate 6 to 8 inches into the substrate. This zone is where the real work happens. There is a crucial nuance in this process. The top 1 or 2 inches of soil must be allowed to dry out completely between irrigation cycles. This sounds counterintuitive, but this drying period acts as a trigger. When the surface dries, the roots effectively panic. They cannot find moisture above, so they are forced to drill downward. This mechanism creates a massive, resilient root system anchored deep in the earth. If the surface stays wet, the roots become lazy. They remain shallow and weak. To verify the condition of the soil, tactile feedback is necessary. Insert a finger near the base of the stem, go down 2 inches. If the medium feels cool and damp, the plant is secure. If the soil crumbles like dry powder, the reserve is empty. It is time to deploy resources. Technology removes the guesswork. A soil moisture probe measures conductivity instantly, providing a precise data point for the grower. Efficiency defines modern yield. In practical agronomy, the most effective tool is the drip irrigation system or the soaker hose. This is not just a hose, it is a logistical network. Black tubing snakes across the bed, delivering liquid directly to the root zone. In slow motion, the water emerges drop by drop, absorbing immediately into the ground. Evaporation is cut to near zero. Every milliliter is utilized by the biological system. When coupled with an automated timer, the human error factor is eliminated. The plants receive a steady, calculated supply without manual intervention. For the grower, this means freedom from the daily routine of dragging hoses. Soaker hoses are particularly viable because of their low cost and rapid deployment, even in small-scale operations. If a drip system is outside the budget, the manual strategy must be adjusted. A light sprinkle on the surface is a waste of capital. The sun evaporates it within minutes. It never reaches the feeder roots. Instead, the water must flow slowly and thoroughly. The soil darkens as the moisture front moves downward. The objective is to water less frequently, perhaps once or twice a week, but with significantly higher volume. This mimics natural heavy rainfall, but water is only half the equation. Mulch acts as the shield. A layer of organic material, 2 to 3 inches thick, changes the thermodynamics of the bed. Straw, shredded leaves, or wood chips form a physical barrier. On the surface, the sun scorches the earth. But underneath the mulch, the soil remains cool and damp. This insulation slows down evaporation and stabilizes the temperature of the root mass. It maintains the equilibrium required for optimal growth. However, input must be balanced with output. Drainage is non-negotiable. If peppers are cultivated in containers, holes in the bottom are mandatory. 18 inches of empty space. That is the precise barrier between a bumper crop and agricultural failure. The ninth reason for yield collapse in bell peppers is density. More specifically, the violation of spatial logistics. Why do growers instinctively crowd their fields? It looks efficient. It feels like maximizing yield per square meter. But in practical agronomy, density is often the enemy of production. When bell pepper plants are compressed, they do not cooperate. They enter a state of biological warfare. The canopy becomes a battleground. Each organism fights for four critical resources: solar radiation, nitrogen uptake, moisture, and atmospheric circulation. The plant's priority shifts instantly. Fruiting is biologically expensive. Survival is mandatory. The genetic code shuts down reproductive systems to preserve energy for vegetative maintenance. The result is a field full of green leaves and 0 calories. Here is the mechanism of failure. Up close, the lower leaves turn pale and chlorotic. They are starved of photons because the neighboring foliage acts as a light-blocking shutter. Without direct solar access, photosynthesis drops below the critical threshold. To survive, the stem elongates rapidly. It stretches upward in a desperate mechanism to breach the canopy. The plant becomes leggy and structurally weak, burning energy on height instead of biomass. Then comes the suffocation. In a dense formation, air currents cannot penetrate the thicket. Humidity spikes. The air creates a stagnant, moist pocket around the stem. This is the incubator for pathology. Spores of powdery mildew land and multiply within hours. Bacterial spots colonize the leaf surface. The smell of damp rot begins to linger near the soil line. Even if the pathogen is held back, wet pollen creates a mechanical failure. Pollination stops. The flower rots before it can set fruit. On the surface, the plants look static. But underground, a turf war is active. Root systems do not share. They act like invasive drills, aggressively seeking the same water table and nitrate pockets. When spacing is tight, the root ball becomes a tangled, choking knot. Fertilizers become useless. The delivery system is clogged by competition. A stressed plant has one directive: stay alive. It produces foliage to capture sun but refuses to generate seed pods. Precision is the only countermeasure. The logic of spacing is mathematical. In a standard row, bell peppers require 18 to 24 inches of clearance. Between the rows, the gap must widen to 24 or even 36 inches. This is not wasted dirt. It is a sanitary buffer zone. It allows ultraviolet light to hit the lower stalk. It permits wind to dry the morning dew. The root system spreads horizontally, securing a dedicated nutrient bank without bumping into a rival. But there is a tactical nuance for smaller plots. If acreage is limited, the grid system changes. Engineers use a staggered pattern, a zigzag formation. This maintains density while maximizing the perimeter for each stalk. But what if the error is already made? In mid-season, the grower must intervene surgically. Pruning becomes necessary. The operator removes lower leaves that touch the damp soil. This opens a ventilation channel at the base. The goal is not to strip the plant, but to engineer airflow. However, sometimes pruning is insufficient. A harder calculation is required. Thinning, the removal of entire plants. It seems counterintuitive to destroy a crop to save it, yet one healthy organism yielding 10 peppers is mathematically superior to 3 stunted plants producing 0. The weak must be culled to stabilize the resource grid. Mistakes in the planning phase compound over time. Using a measuring tape or a pre-cut guide stick is standard protocol. The human eye is unreliable at estimating distance. Without this mechanical check, the canopy closes too fast. The result is inevitable. In fast motion, the crop grows tall, the bottom leaves drop, and the fruit yield flatlines. The peppers that do emerge are undersized, green, and slow to ripen. The plant lacks the caloric surplus to finish the job. Do not be deceived by the initial size of the seedling. A bell pepper is not a tomato, but it is structurally bushy. One tiny yellow flower holds the entire future harvest. But relying on biology alone is a gamble. We have reached the critical bonus protocol mentioned earlier. This technique is the deciding factor when standard variables fail. If the nutrient mix is perfect and the lighting is adequate, yet production remains stagnant, the issue is reproductive mechanics. Specifically, we are looking at pollination failure. Why does a perfect system break down? The answer lies in physics, not just genetics. Bell peppers are technically self-pollinating organisms. They possess both male and female reproductive organs within a single blossom structure. Theoretically, they do not need assistance. The plant wants to reproduce. Its biological imperative is to generate seeds. However, having the machinery does not guarantee operation. Efficiency is not automatic. When this process is weak or incomplete, the plant aborts the mission. Flowers detach and fall to the ground. Fruits that manage to set often become deformed. They remain small, twisted, and hollow. This is a loss of biomass. Instead of a heavy, thick-walled vegetable, you get a stunted, useless lump. Why does the mechanism jam? It usually lacks kinetic energy. In a controlled environment like a greenhouse or an indoor grow room, the air is stagnant. There is no wind to shake the stems. There are no insect vectors to disturb the petals. Even outdoors, long periods of calm weather create a dead zone. The pollen grains sit motionless on the anther. They must travel a few millimeters to the stigma, but without vibration, that distance is an uncrossable canyon. Weather conditions add another layer of complexity. High temperatures cook the pollen, rendering it sterile. Excessive humidity turns dry dust into a sticky paste. It clumps together and refuses to release. On the surface, the flower looks healthy, but inside, the reproductive cycle has stalled completely. If local insect populations are low due to chemical exposure or lack of biodiversity, the problem intensifies. The natural vibration provided by a landing bee is absent. The plant waits, but nothing happens. But there is a manual override. The grower can step in where the environment failed. This is known as hand pollination. It sounds technical, but the mechanics are primitive. The goal is simply to introduce vibration. The most of one tiny vibration triggers the release of genetic material. That is enough to trick the plant into production. While a cotton swab effectively collects the golden dust, professional growers often deploy a more kinetic tool. A clean electric toothbrush is used. This is not a hygiene practice, it is biomimicry. The rapid oscillation of the bristles replicates the specific frequency of a bumblebee's wings. Why does the flower respond to this mechanical hum? Because evolution designed the anthers to hold onto pollen tightly until the right insect arrives. The toothbrush forces the release. Seen in high speed, the flower shudders violently for a fraction of a second. A cloud of microscopic particles explodes from the center, coating the stigma. The grower moves systematically down the row. Touch, vibrate, move. The process is clinical. Efficiency is the priority. Consistency is the only metric that matters in this operation. A single pass is statistically insignificant. The biology of the pepper plant requires repeated signals. This task becomes a daily logistical requirement during the peak flowering window. If the plant does not receive this input, it aborts the reproductive process. The stem turns yellow. The flower detaches and falls to the soil, wasting weeks of energy. With constant mechanical intervention, the fruit set increases drastically. The ovary swells and the pepper begins to take shape. But manual labor is resource-intensive. There is a more autonomous solution. Strategic planting converts the cultivation area into a biological magnet. The objective is to recruit a free workforce. Marigolds are deployed along the perimeter. They are not there for aesthetics. Their chemical signature attracts native bees and beneficial insects. Basil serves a functional purpose as well. Beyond its culinary value, it acts as a companion crops, confusing pests that would otherwise target the peppers. Zinnias, sunflowers, and borage are added to the system. These plants produce high volumes of nectar. The goal is to construct an environment of resource abundance. If the pollinators are foraging on the sunflowers, they will inevitably cross over to the pepper crop. It creates a high-traffic zone for insects. On the surface, it looks like a chaotic garden, but inside, it is a highly efficient pollination network. However,